Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pi, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Matthew Wenger's entrepreneurial story can be traced back to the age of just 8 years old. And from that point, Matt's journey culminates in his current role spearheading the renewable energy transition. He's Harvard educated, musically gifted, and a fantastic CEO of Relevate Power. So join me for this episode of Pivot Points to discover the pivotal moments that shaped his path to leadership. Let me let you introduce yourself, Matt, and just give our listeners a sense of what Relevate Power is and what you've done in your career.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me today, Dave. I appreciate it. It's great to always have a little chat. Again, Matthew Wenger, CEO of Relevate Power. Our mission is to enhance quality of life in local communities by restoring old hydroelectric projects. We find these, beautiful old buildings built, 100, 150 years ago, that could be just critical to providing the necessary renewable energy that our communities require to move on into their next phase. And in many cases, these old plants have been just ignored. And so everybody's, ran to solar and wind and battery, but there's some real challenges with those technologies in terms of providing 24/7 power to local communities. And so in order to preserve and promote quality of life in our rural communities, we find these beautiful old historic buildings and restore them. In terms of my broader career, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been building companies pretty much since I was 8 years old, and ideas and trying to turn them from nothing into something. And along the way, it's been an amazing journey filled with amazing people and ideas and countries, regions. I just feel very blessed and again, pleasure to be here.
Now, you're going to have to tell me what you did at 8, because that's young to be an entrepreneur.
So it's really funny. So this was back in the days when there was something called a paper route that a kid could have. I'm going to date myself here fairly quickly. But so I was 8 years old and I had my little morning paper route, and that was my job. And then the kid with the paper route next door was complaining about his route. And I said, well, I'll take it from you. And so I had my first M&A transaction was at 8 years old when I negotiated over with a couple of hockey cards for his paper route. And then the kid next to him said, well, he was also tired of doing his paper route. So I took his paper route too. So then I had 3 paper routes. And then what I did is I hired a couple, I actually ended up hiring one of those kids back to actually deliver the papers because he needed the money. So so that was my start in kind of the entrepreneurial world.
That's brilliant. Yeah. That's brilliant.
Yeah. In my teens, we got into bulletin board systems. And so the precursors to the internet. And so on Commodore 64s and, my parents asking, why do you need a 6th phone line in the house and all that kind of stuff. So, it's pretty much as far back as I can remember, we've been coming up with ideas and, whether it's, again, it's never just a single person. It's always, a group of us figuring out, hey, what if we did something, a little different here? Just kind of playing around with it.
I mean, was that your sort of first pivotal moment in life where you suddenly realized that you had a different streak inside you?
I don't know. It's fascinating because I've always had a job, and I thank my parents a lot for that because they really didn't believe in just kind of giving you things, so if you wanted something like a bike, my dad grew up in a family of 8 and my mom in a family of 7. So it was like, everybody was expected to kind of, pull their own weight. And they pointed me in the right direction to say, well, maybe, the local gas station will hire you, or maybe, so-and-so. And I always had these things that I wanted to do or achieve, in terms of like, I remember my first BMX bike that I wanted, and parents weren't going to buy it for me. So off I went to go, figure out how to make that happen. And I realized I didn't like working for other people pretty quickly. And other people realized they didn't like me working for them pretty quickly. So you end up with this kind of, okay, well, what can I do there with all this energy? And then you just start, coming up with ideas and taking them to market. And, by the time we were, 15, 16, we were fixing all of our parents' computers, and that had now they'd come out, and they were all these older people were having trouble with technology, which I now am on the other receiving end of that. And we were a bunch of friends and I just started fixing up their old computers, and kind of, again, we didn't incorporate or anything, but we just had this little business, and people would just refer us to other people, and we ended up doing all this kind of stuff, and it just kind of just kept going. So yeah, I would say first pivotal moment was probably that successful little foray into the paper route that got me my first BMX bike, and then from there it was a car, and from there it was university and whatever other things I wanted to get done.
And even when you were going through university, were you doing businesses and running the two things in parallel? Or
in fact, I look back now, and it makes me tired even thinking about what I did. So I took at university I took my student loan. Hope the government doesn't listen to these podcasts, but I took my student loan, and I got my dad in a moment of weakness because I didn't have just quite enough income from all my different gigs that I had. So I was working 3 different jobs. I was a janitor at the university. I was running the fine arts media lab at the university, and I was doing some window washing and stuff around the university as well too. So I was kind of working these 3 different jobs. And then my dad agreed to co-sign for the little bit of extra that I needed. So I took my student loan as a down payment, and I bought an old 1908 house in beautiful. I don't know if you've ever been to Victoria, British Columbia, but it's God's country. The place is just stunning.
Yeah, no, I've not been there. Not been there.
Oh, you have to. It's a place where all smart Brits go to die. So eventually, at some point, it's a big retirement area for.
I think that excludes me if it's smart.
Yeah. So anyway, I bought this old 1908 house in this kind of up and coming artsy neighborhood just off of downtown in Victoria. Immediately went in and started converting it from a single family dwelling to 3 units with an illegal 4th unit in the basement, and then so I would live in the one I was renovating, and then I'd rent out the others. So they were paying the mortgage, they were paying my bills, they were paying everything. And then so I was working 3 jobs, renovating a house. And then when I graduated, I sold the place, paid off mine, and now at that point my first wife's education, just paid it outright off all the money we'd made off the property value increasing. And so it was just another one of those kind of, yes. So absolutely, this is never, I've broken in that place that I can't stop this for some reason.
No, I know early on in your life, you got heavily into music, and music and your business career sort of are intertwined. How did you get into music? Because that sounds like a pivotal shift from a paper round to a house renovator to.
Yeah. So underneath all of this, and it's kind of, that journey to understanding who you are, and some degrees, as you continue to, adjust and change who you're going to become. But my mom bought a piano for the family. I think I would have been maybe 7 years old, would have been just prior to the paper route, and never took lessons. She did bring in a lady to give us lessons once, and that lasted maybe 2 weeks, and then the woman said she was never coming back. So this kind of leads into that whole, I can't, work for anybody else or whatever. So my brother and I just started just playing away on it and just making up things, and just figuring it out, kind of, very much, self-taught, figuring out what we liked, what sounded good, listening to songs, and then trying to recreate them on the piano. And then he decided he wanted to get a guitar. And so by the time he was, I guess I'd be 10 and he'd be 8, we kind of we brought a rental guitar in, and just to see if he'd like it. And that was one thing my parents were really good at, is making sure that there was just, if we needed instruments or stuff like that, they felt that was part of education. And so, they would have some instruments lying around the house, and they didn't belong to anybody. Just say, if you wanted your own instrument, you had to buy it yourself. But there could be instruments in the house. And I can't believe what they put up with over the years, because most parents, probably myself included, would not ever have a drum kit allowed in a house. I don't know how they did it, but we ended up being that one family that had a drum kit in the house as well. And so it was really easy for both of us to kind of form bands because people would just come over. And my dad worked then because it was driving everybody nuts. So we worked to, build this soundproof room. And so learned a little bit of construction out of that project. And so kind of trying to soundproof this and build this studio kind of. And I was really excited for my brother and I. And so yeah, so that's kind of how it started. And then we just kept playing around with this stuff and having other kids come over who were extraordinarily talented. My brother was like, I consider myself, compared to some of the other people who I've played with in my life, to be a tinkerer. I mean, my brother was extraordinarily gifted. He was incredible. So just kept doing that. Went off to university. In my first 2 years, I thought I was really into Hunter S. Thompson, kind of alternative journalism, as I was kind of growing up, and so I thought I'd like to continue kind of that thread. So I went off and did 2 years of journalism school, and that really helped hone the communication skills. It was crazy how hard we had to work on communication, but I realized that was just soul crushing. And I did some internships in media, and I realized that was nothing that I ever wanted to do. And so said, well, heck, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna get a degree in fine arts. And so I went, actually, because I just love music so much. So I challenged for the music program at University of Victoria, and to go into music composition, even though I'd never taken a lesson in my life. So you have all these classically trained musicians, and I just said, hey, listen, here's a bunch of stuff I've written. Here's some small orchestral pieces. Here's some of this. And a guy there named Chris Butterfield was just an amazing guy. And he just looked at this and says, man, it's wonderful to have somebody who comes from a different background, who has different ideas of how music can come together. And so they let me into the program, and then the dean of fine arts let me do a combined directing, stage direction, creative writing, and a music composition degree. And so I got to kind of make my own degree there. To my knowledge, nobody else has ever kind of done it since. And so I just kind of went between these different departments, working on trying to pull together kind of a thesis project that involved music, film, acting, writing, all of that kind of together. And it was really for me, and how that intertwined kind of with the entrepreneurship thing is, it's one thing to try and accomplish anything interesting by yourself. And the beautiful part of that is you have 100% control. But the limiting part of that is that you have 100% control. And a little bit, Dave, what you and I experienced with, that whole kind of think tank company that I had, and I know that could be a different conversation, but this idea of the beauty and the wisdom that comes from enabling the best out of a group of people and trying to, make something from that. And from playing with other musicians growing up and just going, oh my God, like especially my brother, like, that's amazing. What about this? And what if we did some of this? And what if we did that? And trying to kind of shape these things. And then you get all these really wild and interesting characters with, some with egos the size of, the Empire State Building, and, others who are incredibly talented, but don't have enough ego to make it in that space. And figuring out, okay, well, hey, if we got this thing, how about you do this? And how about you do that? And so it just got me involved in leadership at a very early stage towards some kind of common vision, and helping a group come together to kind of say, hey, what if this? What if that? What if we did this? And then have to go, oh, and everybody get excited. And even now, like the hairs on my arm stand up when I think about that process of engaging a group of people in a common, beautiful end outcome that isn't me telling them what to do, but wanting and almost feeding off that reward of what happens when they engage in that. We're all engaged in it together. And that concept is the thing that really enabled, because for a while I was like, like all kind of university students, oh, anybody in business is kind of working for, that's the man. I don't really want to be in business. I was in business because I was trying to figure out how to pay to be a musician, because that's really what I wanted to do, but it didn't pay. And then all of a sudden this thing starts to switch, and you start to realize, wait a sec, what I'm doing is almost no different than writing a song or putting on, and it got really close when I was working on stage theater. That's another one I can tell an interesting story about. And that's a really pivotal one. But working on stage theater where you've got all of these people coming together and you're trying to put on this production, this beautiful production, the and working towards that, that, so it's that kind of mindset that just translated so well into entrepreneurship for me anyway.
Mm. No, I mean, I've often thought that a leadership team is like a great band. And if you get everybody playing in harmony and everybody inspired, and you've got the right people with the right skills, and you've got your CFO, your bass guitarist, and your chief commercial officer as your they all know their parts, they all know their instruments, and you can play crap, or you can make really, really good music. And it's the skill of the orchestrator or the leader to get that band really harmonious and that leadership team really harmonious, which is, I don't know about you, but I find it hard to do. It takes an awful lot of time and effort to get to world class.
And it's really, really fascinating, the mindset change that you have to go through if you are going to do it right. And so if I were to take my early years as an artist, I did impose more of my view on, play it like this or play it like, I would write sometimes all the parts and then ask the guys to play the parts. And those songs were never as good as the ones where it was like, hey, here's a riff. What would you do with that? Right. And so, but you don't learn always all that quick as a teenager, and you still got a little bit of that ego and it's my idea kind of thing going on. And then I was taking a directing course with a gentleman by the name of Harvey Miller, who was had been a Broadway director and come to Victoria to retire. A great, fantastic guy, and my theater project. So I was, I came into this directing course, and the first few plays that I directed were, and you had to direct these kind of short snippets, and they were just awful. Like it was maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and my plays were really bad. And then what I would do is after I had a bad one, I would study the script even harder. And then I would come back and I would then get my next cast and I would work with them on the next, script and then work on that and then try to tell them all what they had to do. And then that one was worse. And then my next play, I studied the script even harder. And so by the time I had to do my full feature, which was Streetcar Named Desire, which is a really tough play to direct well anyway. My directing professor came in and after I was sitting at the back of my theater after my last disaster, just sitting there in the dark, just like, oh my God, like I'm really bad at this. And he came walking in and he hadn't really spoken much to me after my kind of 3 or 4 previous bad plays. And he sat down beside me and he says, what'd you think of that? And I said, oh my God, Harvey, it was just awful. He's like, I went off for a little bit and he let me kind of run. And then he's just like, how long did you spend studying the script? And that's when I went, because like, as though it was so bad because I didn't study the script hard enough. Right. And so I'm just like, I spent, 200 hours studying the script and looking at all my notes, and I was scrambling in the dark trying to show him all my notes that were prepared. And he just goes, how long did you spend casting? And I went, I don't know, an hour. It was a lunchtime thing. I said, Streetcar Named Desire, anybody? And I said, you. Okay, great. He's just like, okay, I want you to flip it. I want you to, it wasn't Streetcar Named Desire, the previous one, but anyway, he said, I want you to flip it. I said, flip it? What do you mean? He says, whatever time you spent studying the script, I want you to spend casting, and whatever time you spent casting, I want you to spend studying the script. Will you promise me you'll do that? And I went, you've got to be kidding me. That would mean I have like an hour or 2 to study the script. Like, how am I going to do a Streetcar Named Desire? He says, just do it. I'm like, okay, so I did it. So I got to read the screenplay or the stage play once. And then I just spent the rest of the time casting. And it was the most beautiful experience I've ever had in my life, because I had to ask, what would you do with this?
Yeah.
And then I found one person. I go, oh my God, I never thought about that. Stanley could be just like that. And then I go, okay, how do I find the right Blanche for that Stanley? And then I went around and had to find the right Blanche for the Stanley. And so the play went off. It was a massive success. It was pretty good. Like, it wasn't awful, I guess. And afterwards, he came up and he's just like, patting me on the back. He says, that was fantastic. Great job. And I said, Harvey, I did nothing. He's just like, pointed out, and he was just like, like to say, like, think about that. But did you really do nothing? And this is a long story, but it goes along with what you're talking about the difference between being the idea guy who feels you have to like champion and this is the idea and this is how this works and this is how this works and this is how it works and cling to all the decisions and cling to all and having to think that you have to know everything. They have to figure everything out. To being the to having that kind of further that little bit of distance from it, having that idea, that vision of what would be great and what we kind of need, and then getting other people excited about that shared vision, and then getting people that lined up and that played off each other really well to then actually, execute and deliver.
Yeah, and I mean, what you did there was build a leadership team, really. I mean, that principle is a genius principle for most chief executives to think about how they build a leadership team. I once worked with a client in Los Angeles called Capital Research and Management. And they're one of the US's biggest investment fund managers. They run American funds, and I think when I worked with them, they had, like $750 billion of assets under management. But the one thing they spent all their time on was if they were going to bring in any person, the minimum number of interviews they did was 23.
Whoa.
They spent hours and hours on casting, but they never made bad hires. They just spent all that time on casting. And I was like gobsmacked when they told me how many, minimum number of interviews. That's such a big learning. So it's all in the people and getting the people right.
Absolutely.
And, the idea is important, but getting the people right.
Absolutely. Because if you, at the end of the day, I have dedicated my life to leaving a positive impact. I mean, that is really kind of my own kind of MO. And so if you look at all the companies I've engaged with, all the things I've tried, again, sometimes, something doesn't work, but that's what, powers in me. And the bigger impact you want to have, the more people you need to engage in a meaningful, aligned, and collective way in service to that idea, right? And so one, it's the people, second, then it's the processes. We've talked, in our past together about, the importance of how we make decisions in a company, right? And if people feel empowered to make decisions, or if people feel they're part of, a decision and they co-own that decision, what happens to the strength of that decision? And so, there's first, there is the people, but then there is this kind of underlying governance / culture, right? That you have to create as well to really then formulate that, to really enhance that impact that you as a collective can have.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, that analogy you just shared it's so deep. And, hearing you talk about yourself growing up and hearing about how you've sort of shaped your own career. I mean, it's clear listening to you that you're somebody who knew how to shape your own destiny from a really early age.
Or had no choice.
I mean, it's something I say to my team all the time. Look, I want you to be responsible for your own career. I want you to shape your own destiny. I don't want to be telling you what to do. I'm here to guide, mentor, support you. But I really want you to think hard, because it's easier for people if you tell them what to do. You've taken a decision out of their life. But if they don't think about why they're doing that, and if they don't make the decision themselves, I never feel they're quite as engaged. And I'd love your perspective on, that thought.
I think it's a beautiful thought. In fact, for me, and particularly, every company has its own, requires its own unique set of values in order to really propagate and be successful. At Relevate Power, with, our objective, the vision for Relevate is to become the most trusted provider of 24/7 power for rural America. That's what we want to, that's where we're moving towards. And so in order to become, and the really key there is the most trusted. It's not the biggest or the best of this or that or whatever. It's the most trusted. And if we believe that other success comes from being the most trusted. And what's fascinating is if you look at our core values, the number one core value, and they are kind of stack ranked, our number one core value is we don't grow the company using people. We grow people using the company. And it's a commitment that I make to every employee, whether they're my direct reports or all the way down. If you're hired into this company, that is my commitment. And therefore, I'm going to hold everybody down the line, myself starting, and everybody down the line accountable to that commitment. And what that does is it pivots all of us. The commercial universe, in some ways, is by nature transactional. It's a little bit dehumanizing. One could relate almost all businesses to the oldest profession. It's like, I need you to, I really want you to do something, so I'm going to pay you for it. Right. And I will take your money. And if you want me to do that job over there, I'm going to need more money. Or, if you want me to do that job over there, I'm going to need more money. Right. So it can become highly transactional and all about greed and all about, me and all that kind of stuff. And again, it's not a critique of, I don't think the whole capitalist world needs to come down or anything like that. I'm not going to do my best Che Guevara impression at this point. But what I just found is, and again, maybe this comes a little bit from coming at entrepreneurship and business company building from an artist's point of view, is I just wanted to bring that sense of humanity, that sense of where the hairs stand on your arm because you're working together for something you believe in, right? And if I grow a company using you, invariably I'm using you. Whereas if what I do is if I force us all to look at the challenges that the company is facing, and my job is to grow you using the challenges of the company. My job is not to grow the company. My job is to grow you using the challenges of the company. Now what I've got to do is I have to sit down. I have to get to know all of you. I actually have to get to understand, like, where are you going and what? Where do you want to go? What does growth look like for you? What are you curious about? Was there something that you've never done before that you'd like to try? And then lining those opportunities up for those people.
Do you find when you do that in the first instance with people that they're a bit guarded, they don't quite believe you, that it takes a while for that idea to be believed and trusted?
Everything about us takes a while to be believed and trusted. There's this thing where so many people, myself included, when I was a younger entrepreneur, I thought all I needed to do was say something and then you should trust me. But over time, you learn this through your own interactions with other people too. It's our actions. It's the decisions we make. And do they align with the words you've said? And it's this repeated pattern of he said this and then did this. She said this and then did this. Whether that is, validating or whether it's, non-validating, that's what drives your trust. And so some things that we've done to try to make sure that gets hammered in is our performance reviews are based on the core values. So I actually, your bonus, your financial incentives are to do these things. So I actually align how we compensate people with the core values, not with, did we achieve 10% growth in EBITDA this year, or did you achieve that? There's team objectives and company objectives that look to that. But your individual objectives are based on the company's values.
Yeah, I mean, that really is value-driven growth and value-driven mindset. And, I believe for a long time, if you get people engaged, if you get people behind a common purpose, you don't have to ask them to do the work. They do the work because they want to. And if you're measuring people on how they live your values, you'll probably get greater growth than if you measure them on growth per se. But so many leaders don't seem to believe that. They seem to be, of the mindset that we've got to do that transactional, I'll pay you to do this job and I'll pay you more to do this job. And they miss out that emotional, they really miss out on the power of emotion, I find, so many times. And at our own company, Brand Pie, we try and help people understand the power of emotion and engagement and leadership alignment. And when they discover it, they just go like, wow, why don't they teach this at Harvard and get us to understand it? Because it's almost like they're trained to be so rational and so transactional. Yeah, what's your perspective on that?
I think it's really, I agree with you. I think people have to be, you have to still be very careful. You can end up being accused of just manipulating them. So like there's this fine line. And so there's another piece that has to come in there, which is authentic emotion, right? Like I believe I'm an effective leader because I've learned to be very authentic, uncomfortably authentic at times with the people around me, right? See, I'm not, again, I have just a couple of eccentricities. I didn't come into this space in the same way that everybody else did. I see the world a little differently, but I'm okay with that. I don't try and pretend to be a leader like I saw on television or Jack Welch or anybody else who and again I'm not accusing them of being inauthentic. I'm sure Jack Welch was extremely authentic and that was his true self. So it's this linkage between I fundamentally absolutely agree. You've got to get, and whether you want to call it emotional buy-in or whether you want to call it personal buy-in. I have a tendency to lean more towards personal buy-in. It's not just my wallet, but it's my person that feels moved by this. And as a leader, in order to engage that, because I have seen that go badly, where if somebody reads an article that says you have to engage, in this emotion kind of way, and they're just not that person, and that ends up looking very inauthentic, which then hurts trust, which then hurts the whole purpose and all of that other kind of thing as well too.
Yeah, you definitely can't go from one to the other in a nanosecond. I mean, if you are going to use those types of techniques, you've got to do it carefully and gently, for sure. Otherwise, you're right, it will look inauthentic. And I love that sort of personal dimension and making it, about them and their growth and their development. I kept coming back to sort of Relevate Power. I mean, upper state New York, all of these rivers, hydro power stations. How did you come up with the idea? How did you get funding? I mean, that sounds like a mini mountain you climb, just, because I can hear people going like, oh, well, that's a bonkers idea. Why would you do that?
And the first one who said it was my wife. Now I will say that she is an incredibly supportive lady. And I couldn't absolutely do any of these things without her support. But she was the first one to stay. I came home one day from a meeting and I said, I think I know what the next idea is. And I was scared to even tell her because I knew what her reaction was. And it wasn't as polite as bonkers, if I recall correctly.
Well, that was me being very British.
Exactly. So if we dial it back, after graduating from college, I moved back to a very beautiful part of Canada, just west of Banff and Jasper and Lake Louise, called the Kootenays. It's north of Spokane, Washington, all the way over to Montana. It's a beautiful part of the world, and my family goes back there over 100 years. And in the 1960s, so I moved back there just to kind of ski, play music, and figure out what to do. I founded a little tech company, very similar to Geek, what in the U.S. and Canada we call Geek Squad now. The cell phone had been invented, and so we could take a cell phone in cars and just dominate kind of the computer software, networking, and internet was just starting. So, there was this kind of, vibe in the air. But I just was looking for a way to pay for my music still. Anyway, so there was this, in the 1960s, the Americans had built all these dams on the Columbia River. It's the most dammed river in the world. And they built all these dams south of the Canadian border. And instead, and in the dry season, they weren't able to generate enough power. And in the wet season, they had too much water. And so they turned to the Canadian government and said, hey, would you guys put a bunch of dams on the Columbia north of the border? And we'll give you $1 billion a year if you do that for us to hold back water in the wet season and let it go down in the dry season so we could generate power year round. Canada was like, yeah, sure. And so Canadian government basically kicked all of my ancestors off the prime agricultural, forestry, residential land all along the Columbia River here, and a whole bunch of others as well too. Well, fast forward 30 years, the Columbia River Treaty was up for renewal, and everybody kind of felt a little screwed who was living in our region. And so, and we had all of our clients were like the local mayors and regional district officers and stuff like that. And so they were looking for a young volunteer to sit on the economic development committee of this new thing called the Columbia Basin Trust. And what they were going to do, these mayors, is they were going to stick it to the Canadian government and say, basically, we're going to protest and not get behind this, restarting of this deal unless you give us the ability to give us 3 of these dams that are non-power generating and allow us to convert them into power generating facilities. And then we'll put all that money that we make into a not-for-profit trust called the Columbia Basin Trust. And we'll spend all of that money on social, economic, and environmental development work, because at this point in time now, we got 17.5% unemployment in the region or something. It was just ridiculous. It was, commodities-based, part of the world. And so we actually managed to get it through and got the Canadian government and provincial government to sign off. And we got a loan from them and a guarantee from them to build these power generators on these dams. And now it's a $2 billion organization that cuts $200 million a year in checks to social, economic, and environmental development work. So I got to see firsthand. And I was made the founding director of IT and operations for the Columbia Basin Trust and Columbia Power Corporation, who was meant to kind of sell the power and manage the power as well as manage the grant making side.
It's sounding less bonkers now.
Well, exactly right. Now it gets a little less bonkers. So now, because what I got to experience was what happens when you engage all of these. We engaged thousands of stakeholders, First Nations group, medical groups, education groups, social groups, all these things all around the basin to say, this is what we're trying to do. We're going to form this, organization for us, put these assets in here, and then all the profits we make, we're going to spend on making this place a better place to live. In other words, if you go back to, Relevate Power now, this concept of powering local life. So I actually got to see firsthand what happens when you do this at mass scale and the impacts that not just financially, the trust does very well financially, but the social, the economic, and the environmental development work that we got to do because we united around a broader good that if we aligned on how this shared resource could be used by all of us, that we could make lives for everybody so much better. So now I went off and did a whole bunch of other things. I founded tech, so from there I got into telecommunications. We did rural broadband. We did hardware and software manufacturing. I got lucky a couple of times. Did this, the software company think tank. They, had a little luck there, and then was doing venture capital and private equity and thinking about it. But I was bored, and I to be honest, my line is always, I got tired of giving people my money and my advice and having them take my money. And so really what it was is I'm a company builder. What I'm passionate about is getting the band together, right? Getting that next idea and getting the band together. And so my partner and I at the time, who were working on this in this fund, were like looking for ideas and we were looking at the kind of the nexus between food, energy, and water, because that's where we see kind of the crises of the future really kind of happening. And where we thought we could really make a difference given our backgrounds. And so we looked at, instead of putting our money and investing in other people's companies, we looked at it and say, okay, well, why don't we take our money and invest it in ideas that we might have? And one of those ideas happened to be this, looking at, some small hydro, somebody came by with it, Mike, my partner, had a turbine idea, and he'd been working on that for a while. And that had got him kind of into the hydro space. And so then some hydro guys were coming by talking about what they were working on. And maybe, Mike's turbine could be sold into there. But the more we got looking at it, we just realized that, wow, wait, there's a real opportunity. It's not to sell the turbines, these new technologies into these plants. The business opportunity is to buy the actual whole plant, because nobody has been upgrading these things. At best, a lot of these technologies in these dams were upgraded last in the 1980s. 1990s. So you got 40, 50-year-old technologies in these things. So what we can do is come along and basically put robotics, process automation into these old plants and have, automate them so that they actually manage and run themselves at the absolute peak of optimization. upgrade some components now that increase their production and generation. And then on top of that, you've got all this excess land usually around these dams. And so we look to add some solar and some battery. And so we really become this 24/7 clean energy hub in this rural area where these dams were originally put. And then you start to look at those knock-on effects, and it gets, extremely exciting for a guy like me who sees this old, 150-year-old building, all this old history. A lot of these towns, Dave, they only existed because there was a dam there. And all of the interior of the U.S. was populated based on having access to running water, because running water, we might not have had electricity in the 1700s, but we still needed them for our sawmills and our paper mills and our leather and our all these manufacturing processes that we had. It was mechanical energy just coming through, and the dam and the turbines were spinning, moving this shaft that would then move these machines that then produced whatever product was. So all of these interior towns, their histories are built on these structures. Without them, the town wouldn't exist. And so you fast forward, you come along now, and I'm traveling around and I'm seeing all these plants just in disrepair, and I'm looking at these towns and they're all in disrepair. And yet now you've got data centers and AI and all of this stuff that wants to come out to the rural areas. You've got the ski hills, you've got when you go for recreation from Manhattan, when you lived in Manhattan, you don't stay in the city, you go upstate, you go to these other places, right? And you've got what's fascinating is people talk about range anxiety, and that's what's keeping the average American from buying an electric car. But why do you have range anxiety? It's not from driving around in the city, it's from wanting to go out to the rural areas. And so the place where we most need 24/7 renewable power right now, is the place where it's hardest to get it. And so for us to look at taking this and restoring these beautiful facilities to their prior glory, and then taking them beyond to serve now, these things served the industrial growth of the past. And now what we want them is positioned to really support that digital, that wonderful, clean digital future that these communities can have going forward.
And are you getting a ripple effect? It may be too early in the life cycle, but I could see if you rejuvenate the power, then you're going to rejuvenate the town, and you're going to start to see people moving back in. If you go up the Hudson and you see that sort of effect of New York, the further you go, and towns, are you seeing that sort of rejuvenation already starting to happen and attracting in those new technology startups and things like that?
Yes, I don't want to overstate it, because in some of these,
no, it's early.
It's early, but if we just look at the inbound calls that we get, so in the last probably 4 weeks, we probably get, I'd say in the last, every month, I would say we're probably right now dealing with about 10 inbounds from Bitcoin operators who want to put a Bitcoin mining site by one of our plants. We probably get about 5 inquiries from data centers looking to locate a data center near these facilities, and then getting, starting to look at cooling with water, because again, land is much cheaper up there. And now if we can provide them with cheap 24/7 renewable energy, then now you've got all those jobs that come with it. So I can't point right now to an example where I can go, yes, Dave, right here, this company has located already. But we've only been at this for, as Elevate and now Relevate Power, we've only been at this for 18 months. Before that, it was 3 years of growth and testing the models and that kind of stuff.
No, I mean, I see you've already got some serious investors and backers behind it. And I think you've just done a recent acquisition is it supported by Apollo and Gravity?
Yeah.
It's becoming very serious very quickly by the look of it. And what's the reaction of the investors? I mean, are they excited by what you're doing?
Yeah, and that can be a little bit of a problem, as I'm sure many other entrepreneurs have experienced. Sometimes when you have a great idea that's kind of fairly unique or original, one of the challenges is everybody wants to hear the pitch. And so you can spend a lot of time pitching and talking to a lot of people who may never invest. And one of the challenges with the hydro story, why has nobody done this before? Is always a fair question. And the challenge is that operating a hydro plant isn't always that easy. If you do it wrong, then you can actually, if there's a community right underneath that dam and you do your job wrong, you can wash away that community. So there's this really, really important responsibilities that come along with owning and operating a hydroelectric plant. If you don't operate people, if you don't have the right safety equipment and stuff in place, people can be sucked into the actual dam if they get too close to it and the plant is running. And so there's public safety issues on a individual human level. There's public safety issues on a community level. There's regulatory issues. There's agencies. There's all of these external forces that you've got, that you're essentially a steward now for this shared resource for all of these stakeholders. And some people don't much care for stewardship and the responsibilities that come along with that. So while you get a lot of people who want to hear the pitch, once they start getting in and digging in and say, "Oh, wait a sec, I've never invested in anything like that before, but I want to invest in clean energy. What you guys are doing sounds amazing. I want in." And then you say, "Okay, have you ever heard?" Now our test is: have you ever heard of FERC? Have you ever heard of the Department of Energy? Have you ever heard of the Department of the Environment or Fish and Wildlife or the Clean Rivers Group or whatever? And say, because guys like this, so just like you need a certain type of entrepreneur and operator who has experience, in the market, who can see what the opportunities are and know how to navigate that. I believe you also need a certain type of investor. And so while we've had a lot of excitement, it's, our challenge has been now narrowing those down into those people that actually can and do and have a record of investing, in this space. And people who've done it before. And there's been a few folks who have done, I don't want to say exactly what we're doing, but rolling up hydros into portfolios and managing them really well, have done very well by their investors. And so there is a track record of people who, when they do execute these strategies well, do way better than market, right? Because if everybody's rushing into solar investing, for example, it becomes a race to the bottom as to, how much returns are there. Whereas if not very many people are investing in the space, and somebody can figure out how to get, value out of that, then there's some, pretty exciting returns you can generate.
No, I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic story, and I'm so proud of you to sort of share that and let people understand. I mean, I think we're going to hear a lot more of Relevate Power and what you're doing. It's a fantastic story of regeneration, but in a very modern way, and I can see the niche. Yeah, I can see why data centers, they want reliable power sources. They need access to cooling. It's a very clever idea, and well done to you. And we should probably draw to a close now, and just let me thank you for spending the time with us. And I think people are going to find that a fantastic sort of podcast to listen to. And thank you, Matt, for sparing the time to spend with us.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate it. And as always, I always enjoy these conversations, Dave. So anytime.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brand Pi and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brandpi.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.